In the quiet seaside town of Harborview, mornings were often cloaked in a soft mist that drifted lazily over the weathered docks and creaking boats. The salty tang of the ocean mingled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee from the little cafes that lined the harbor. It was a place where time seemed to move slower, where everyone knew each other by name, and where the rhythm of life was dictated by the tides and the calls of seagulls. Yet beneath this serene exterior, tension simmered quietly, unnoticed by most, until one crisp autumn morning shattered the fragile peace. George Miller, a man weathered by time and trials, shuffled down the cracked sidewalk outside the Harborview Cafe. At 72, his back was slightly bent, the lines etched deeply into his face, telling stories of battles fought both abroad and at home. A decorated military veteran, George carried the weight of his past with a quiet dignity, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of sacrifice and steadfast resolve. Today, his steps were slow but purposeful. He was on his way to the cafe for his usual morning ritual, a cup of black coffee and a moment of solace before the day's demands took hold. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe to never miss a new video. And tell me, where are you watching this video from? I love seeing all different people come together for these stories. As George approached the cafe's worn wooden benches, a group of teenagers loitered nearby, their presence jarring against the town's gentle ambiance. The leader, a bratty teen named Dylan, lounged with a swagger that was more arrogance than confidence. His gang, a cluster of restless youths with sneers and slouched postures, eyed George with a mix of contempt and boredom. Harborview's youth had grown restless, their respect for the older generation eroding like the crumbling pier at the edge of town. George's gaze met Dylan's for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of the divide between them. The veteran's pride was palpable. He wore his scars with honor, even as he recognized the changing tides in his beloved town. Dylan, sensing an easy target, stepped forward with a mocking grin, his voice cutting through the morning air like a jagged knife. "Hey, old man, what's the hurry? Trying to get your coffee before it gets cold?" He jeered, laughter bubbling up from his companions. George, unflinching, tightened his grip on the worn leather strap of his satchel. "Just passing through," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. But the gang was not to be deterred. With the careless cruelty that often accompanies youth, Dylan reached into a nearby cafe table where a steaming cup of coffee had been left unattended. Without hesitation, he seized the cup and hurled its contents toward George. The scalding liquid splashed across the veteran's jacket, the hot liquid soaking deep into the fabric and stinging his skin beneath. The cafe's patrons gasped, their faces a mixture of shock and discomfort. Yet, no one rose to intervene. Fear and apathy held them frozen in place. Emma, a young cafe employee who had watched the scene unfold from behind the counter, clenched her fists. She disapproved of the bullies' behavior but felt powerless to challenge them openly. The tension in the air thickened as the town's unspoken rules of silence and avoidance came into sharp relief. George staggered slightly, the searing pain radiating from his shoulder. His eyes, usually calm and resolute, flickered with a mixture of surprise and hurt. But years of discipline and resilience kept him from retaliating. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath, straightened his posture, and turned to leave, unwilling to grant his tormentors the satisfaction of a reaction. Dylan's laughter echoed louder, emboldened by the apparent submission. "That's right. Walk away, Grandpa. This town's ours now." As George stepped away from the cafe, his mind was already racing. His son Jake, a Navy SEAL, was due home soon from deployment. Jake's presence in Harborview was a beacon of hope and strength, a reminder of the values George had fought to defend. The thought of Jake's return lent George a quiet determination not to let this moment define him or the town he loved. The mist that had settled over Harborview seemed to thicken in the wake of the incident, as if nature itself mourned the loss of innocence. The docks, usually bustling with fishermen and early risers, stood silent and empty, mirrors to the unease spreading through the community. Beneath the surface of this sleepy town, a storm was gathering, one that would test the bonds of family, honor, and justice. Emma watched George disappear down the street, her heart heavy with regret. She knew something had to change, that the complacency of the townspeople would only embolden the bullies further. Yet, the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with risks and the possibility of confrontation. For now, she could only hope that Jake's return would be the catalyst for the courage that Harborview so desperately needed. Meanwhile, George made his way home, the fabric of his jacket still damp and warm against his skin. He moved with a quiet grace, the steps of a man who had faced far greater adversities but now confronted a different kind of battle. One for respect and dignity in a town that seemed to be losing its way. The echoes of the morning's humiliation lingered, but beneath them burned a resilient flame, fueled by the love for his son and the memory of his service. As the sun began to pierce through the mist, casting long shadows across the harbor, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake Harborview to its core. George's story was just beginning, intertwined with the return of Jake and the challenge of facing a generation that had forgotten the meaning of honor. The peaceful rhythm of the seaside town had been disrupted, and soon the currents of change would sweep through its streets, carried on the wings of courage and resolve. In this quiet moment before the coming storm, the town held its breath, unaware that the tide was turning and that the strength of one family would become a beacon for a community on the brink of transformation. The mist slowly lifted, revealing a harbor not just of boats and fishermen, but of hope, resilience, and the enduring fight for justice. George Miller sat quietly on the creaky wooden porch of his small, weather-beaten home overlooking the harbor. The cool breeze tugging gently at the edges of his worn jacket, still damp from the morning's assault. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor and service, rested on his knees, steady but tense. The sun was beginning its slow climb over Harborview, casting long shadows that stretched across the town's narrow streets and faded storefronts. Despite the town's picturesque charm, George's eyes carried a weariness born not just of age, but of the shifting tides he could no longer ignore. He was a man forged by discipline and sacrifice, a decorated war veteran whose life had been shaped by courage in the face of adversity. Yet now, in the twilight of his years, it was not the battlefield that tested him, but the changing culture of the town he had called home for decades. The once respectful nods from passers-by had grown scarce, replaced by averted gazes and whispered indifference. George felt the sting of that loss keenly, as sharp as the coffee that had been thrown on him just hours before. Behind the kitchen window, his wife, Margaret, moved about with quiet concern, preparing lunch but stealing glances toward her husband's somber figure. She understood the pride that kept George silent, but it was evident to her that the morning's humiliation had shaken him more deeply than he admitted. Their home, filled with mementos of a life well lived, framed medals, old photographs, and letters from distant wars, stood as a testament to a past that seemed increasingly at odds with the present. Meanwhile, the town's youth, restless and emboldened, carried on with their days seemingly unaware of the consequences their actions inflicted. Dylan, the bratty teen who had led the morning's attack, strutted down the main street with his usual swagger, flanked by his gang of followers. His laughter rang out, loud and brash, a challenge to anyone who might dare oppose him. To Dylan, George was just another obstacle in a town that he believed belonged to his generation now. A generation that disrespected the old guard and reveled in their unchecked power. Inside the Harborview Cafe, Emma wiped down tables with practiced motions, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door whenever the bell chimed. She had witnessed the morning's ordeal, the cruel spectacle of the bullies' taunts and the scalding coffee, and it unsettled her deeply. Emma was young, barely out of high school, but she carried a quiet strength beneath her gentle demeanor. Unlike many others in Harborview, she refused to turn away from injustice, even when it scared her. Her position was complicated, caught between the fear of retaliation from Dylan's gang and her own sense of right. She wanted to speak out, to defend George and others like him, but the weight of the town's unspoken code of silence loomed heavily over her. Yet, Emma's conscience would not let her remain passive. She knew something had to be done. Harborview's soul was at stake. Dylan's gang had carved out their small kingdom of influence, bolstered by the tacit approval of their parents, prominent figures in the community who preferred to dismiss their son's misbehavior as youthful indiscretion. This protective shield only emboldened the teens further, eroding the respect that once defined the town's social fabric. Dylan thrived on this unchallenged dominance, his teasing and taunts growing more frequent and brazen with each passing day. Back at George's house, the weight of these changes pressed heavily on him. He thought often of his son, Jake, a Navy SEAL whose deployment had kept him away from Harborview for too long. Jake was the embodiment of the values George held dear: discipline, honor, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The anticipation of Jake's imminent return stirred something within George, a flicker of hope amid the growing darkness. He believed that Jake's presence could shift the balance, restore a measure of respect and order to the town. Yet, George also wrestled with the changing attitudes around him. The town's elders seemed increasingly sidelined, their voices drowned out by a younger generation that neither understood nor valued the sacrifices made for their safety and freedom. This disconnect gnawed at George's pride and patience, fueling a quiet determination to confront the disrespect head-on. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, George made his way back to the Harborview Cafe, his steps deliberate despite the lingering discomfort in his shoulder. He needed to face the place where the humiliation had occurred, to reclaim a piece of his dignity in the eyes of the community. The cafe, usually bustling with chatter and the clinking of coffee cups, seemed subdued, patrons casting wary glances toward the door as he entered. Emma approached him cautiously, a mixture of admiration and concern in her eyes. "Mr. Miller," she said softly, "I'm so sorry about what happened this morning. It wasn't right." George nodded, his voice gravelly but firm. "Thank you, Emma. It's not about me. It's about what's happening to this town. We can't let it become a place where fear and disrespect rule." Emma hesitated, then spoke with a quiet resolve. "I want to help. I want to do something about Dylan and his gang. They're tearing the community apart." George looked at her, a spark of hope lighting his tired eyes. "It'll take more than just good intentions. It'll take courage, and it'll take standing together, not just us, but the whole town." Outside, the late afternoon light cast long shadows, mirroring the growing divide within Harborview. The confrontation between old values and new attitudes was no longer just a simmering tension. It was boiling to the surface. George, Emma, and the few others who still believed in respect and decency faced a daunting challenge: to reclaim their town from the grip of fear and apathy. As dusk settled, George returned home, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders, but his spirit unbroken. He thought of Jake, imagining his son's steady gaze and calm strength, the kind that could rally a community to stand up against injustice. The veteran's mind was already turning, planning for the days ahead when Jake would walk through the door and the fight for Harborview's soul would truly begin. In the quiet of his home, George allowed himself a moment of reflection. The world outside was shifting, the tides of change relentless and unforgiving. But beneath the surface, the steadfast heart of a proud veteran beat strong, a heart that refused to yield, that sought not just to survive, but to restore the dignity and honor of a town on the brink. The stage was set, the players gathering, and the small town of Harborview held its breath once more, poised at the edge of a reckoning that would test the bonds of family, community, and courage. The chill of early evening settled over Harborview as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting a muted glow over the town's narrow streets. The harbor lay still, its waters reflecting the fading light and the quiet unease that had begun to seep into the community. George Miller, his jacket still bearing the faint scent of coffee, moved deliberately along the cracked pavement, his steps measured but resolute. The morning's humiliation had not broken him. Instead, it had ignited a determination that pulsed beneath his weathered exterior. But the morning's aggression was only the beginning. The restless energy of Dylan and his gang had escalated beyond cruel words and reckless taunts. The small group of teenagers, emboldened by their unchecked behavior and the silence of onlookers, had crossed a line that threatened not only George's dignity, but the fragile peace of Harborview itself. It started with the disappearance of Max, George's loyal dog, a sprightly golden retriever who had been his constant companion through long days and lonely nights. Max was more than a pet. He was a symbol of comfort and steadfastness in George's life. So when the dog vanished without a trace, George's heart tightened with a mix of confusion and dread. Word spread quickly among the townspeople, whispered with a mixture of sympathy and apprehension. Dylan's gang had taken Max, using the dog as a cruel bargaining chip to provoke and torment George. Further, the message was clear. Respect was no longer expected or given, and those who clung to the past were vulnerable to humiliation and harm. George's search for Max became a quiet crusade. Day after day, he scoured the docks, alleyways, and hidden corners of Harborview, calling out the dog's name with a voice that carried both hope and desperation. Yet, the town's usual warmth seemed to have turned cold, as neighbors averted their eyes or offered hollow condolences. The community's reluctance to confront the bullies deepened the veterans' isolation, intensifying the sense of an invisible divide growing between generations. Inside the Harborview Cafe, Emma watched the unfolding drama with mounting concern. She had long been troubled by the bullies' unchecked reign, and the kidnapping of Max was a stark escalation that could no longer be ignored. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped down tables, the memory of the morning's scalding coffee incident still fresh in her mind. This time, the stakes were higher, and the need for action more urgent. Emma's gaze flicked toward the cafe's entrance repeatedly, hoping for a sign that someone would stand up against the bullying. But the patrons remained silent, paralyzed by fear or unwilling to get involved. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a collective hesitation that seemed to condone the cruelty through inaction. Meanwhile, Dylan and his gang reveled in their newfound dominance. Their laughter echoed through the streets, a harsh soundtrack to their escalating provocations. The theft of Max was a calculated move to humiliate George publicly and to send a message to anyone who might dare challenge their authority. The bullies' audacity was fueled by the protection they enjoyed from influential parents who dismissed their sons' behavior as youthful mischief, shielding them from consequences and accountability. One afternoon, as George passed near the harbor, he caught sight of the gang gathered near an abandoned boathouse. His heart pounded as he recognized Max's familiar silhouette chained inside, the dog's eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and relief upon seeing his owner. George's voice trembled as he called out, "Max, here, boy." Dylan stepped forward, a smug grin playing on his lips. "Looking for your little friend, old man? You're too late." The gang jeered, their voices laced with mockery. George's fists clenched at his sides, but he maintained his composure, the discipline honed through years of service holding his anger in check. He assessed the situation carefully, knowing that rash action could worsen matters. Just then, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed from the street. Jake Miller, returning from a surprise early leave, appeared at the edge of the scene, his presence commanding attention. His military bearing was unmistakable. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm intensity in his eyes that shifted the dynamics instantly. Jake's canine partner, Shadow, a sleek German shepherd trained for protection and obedience, moved by his side, alert and poised. The dog's low growl was a silent warning to the gathered youths. "Let the dog go," Jake said, his voice steady but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Now," Dylan's grin faltered as he sized up the newcomer. He had heard stories about Jake Miller, the Navy SEAL who commanded respect wherever he went, but had never faced him directly. The gang's bravado wavered in the face of Jake's unwavering gaze and the poised threat of Shadow. Emma, watching from the cafe doorway, felt a surge of hope. Jake's return was more than a reunion. It was a turning point. The crowd that had gathered, previously silent and fearful, began to stir, emboldened by the arrival of someone willing to stand against the bullies. Jake stepped forward, his posture relaxed but authoritative. "This ends here. You're done." The tension broke as Dylan reluctantly signaled his gang to step back. Max was freed from his chains, bounding to Jake and George with joyous energy. The dog's tail wagged furiously, sensing the shift in the air. George exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him as he knelt to embrace Max. Jake's presence had changed everything. Where there had been fear and silence, now there was a rallying force. But even as the crowd dispersed, murmurs of dissent and defiance lingered beneath the surface. The town's deep-rooted issues of respect, fear, and authority had not vanished with Jake's arrival. The battle lines had been drawn, the stage set for a larger confrontation that would demand more than just a show of strength. Emma approached Jake and George cautiously, her eyes shining with gratitude and determination. "Thank you for coming. We need someone like you. Someone who won't back down." Jake nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm here to help, but this isn't just about Max or George. It's about changing a culture that's allowed this to happen." As the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, casting Harborview into twilight, a new chapter began. The quiet seaside town, once marred by fear and apathy, now had a spark of resistance. With Jake and his canine partner at the forefront, the community stirred from its silence, ready to face the challenges ahead. The night air carried a whisper of hope, mingled with a promise of justice and the courage to reclaim what had been lost. Harborview's story was far from over. It was merely awakening. As dawn broke over Harborview, the town stirred with a restless energy, the quiet after the previous evening's confrontation giving way to murmurs of unease and whispered conversations. The arrival of Jake Miller, the Navy SEAL, and his canine partner, Shadow, had injected a new tension into the community, but not everyone welcomed the disruption. Among those watching from the shadows was Tom Reynolds, the local police chief, a man whose loyalty to the town's established order ran deeper than his commitment to justice. Chief Reynolds, a stocky man with a graying mustache and a perpetually furrowed brow, sat behind his cluttered desk in the dimly lit police station. Files and reports were stacked haphazardly around him, but his focus was elsewhere. He had heard about the recent incidents, the coffee thrown on George Miller, the kidnapping of Max, and Jake's sudden return, and his thoughts were clouded by a mixture of frustration and protectiveness. To Reynolds, Dylan and his gang were merely wayward youths, products of a town struggling to find its footing in changing times. His approach was pragmatic, if not cynical. These kids being kids didn't warrant the kind of scrutiny or intervention that outsiders might expect. Harborview was small, its people tightly knit, and Reynolds saw himself as a guardian of that fragile balance, even if it meant turning a blind eye to certain indiscretions. When Emma approached the station that morning, her hands clutching a hastily recorded video of the Bullies' latest antics, she found the chief behind his desk, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. "Chief Reynolds," she began, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "You need to see this." Reluctantly, the chief took the phone from her and watched the footage. The taunts, the theft of Max, the gang's blatant disrespect. His expression remained unreadable, but Emma detected a flicker of annoyance. When the video ended, he sighed heavily. "Emma, I appreciate your concern," he said slowly, "but these are kids from good families. They're just pushing boundaries. You have to understand the dynamics here. We can't just go around arresting teenagers for every foolish stunt." "But Chief," Emma pressed, "this isn't just foolishness. It's deliberate harassment. George Miller is a respected veteran, and this behavior is tearing the community apart. If you don't act, it sends the message that this is acceptable." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I'm responsible for maintaining order, not stirring up trouble. You have to pick your battles, Emma. Sometimes it's better to let things settle on their own." Emma's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but she knew arguing further would be futile. She left the station with a heavy heart, her resolve hardening. The law, which should have been a shield for the vulnerable, was instead a barrier to justice. Meanwhile, Jake was not one to accept such complacency. Meeting with George and Emma later that day in the shelter of George's modest living room, he laid out his concerns. "Chief Reynolds isn't going to help us," Jake said bluntly, his voice low and steady. "He's part of the problem, protecting the bullies because of their families and the town's politics." George nodded, the lines on his face deepening with a mixture of anger and resignation. "I've seen this before. Sometimes the people sworn to protect us are the ones who turn their backs. But that doesn't mean we give up." Emma spoke up, her eyes bright with determination. "If the local authorities won't act, maybe it's time to bring in help from outside. Someone who can see this clearly, without the town's history clouding their judgment." Jake considered this, the gears turning behind his calm exterior. "I have some contacts from my military days, federal agents who take these kinds of cases seriously. If we can get their attention, maybe we can force the town's hand." The room fell silent for a moment, each of them weighing the risks. Federal involvement would be a serious escalation, one that could shake up Harborview's delicate balance. But with the local police chief unwilling to uphold justice, it seemed the only viable path forward. Outside, the community buzzed with conflicting emotions. Some residents whispered support for the bullies, dismissing the incidents as rites of passage or harmless pranks. Others, particularly the older generation and veterans, felt betrayed by the town's unwillingness to protect its own. The fractures within Harborview widened, the town's unity strained by fear, loyalty, and the struggle for respect. In the cafe, Emma confided in a trusted friend, Mrs. Simmons, the school counselor who had quietly advocated for students caught in similar cycles of bullying. "The police won't help, and the bullies are getting worse," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need a plan, something that can make a real difference." Mrs. Simmons nodded thoughtfully, her experience with troubled youth giving her insight into the deeper issues at play. "It's not just about discipline," she said. "It's about changing the culture, teaching respect, empathy, and accountability. But that takes time, and it takes courage from the whole community." Jake and George met with Mrs. Simmons later that week, discussing strategies to bring the community together and support the victims of bullying. They planned town hall meetings, outreach programs, and efforts to raise awareness about the consequences of unchecked aggression. But they knew these efforts would face resistance, especially from those invested in maintaining the status quo. Back at the police station, Chief Reynolds received a call from one of the town's influential figures, a parent of one of Dylan's closest friends. The message was clear: keep things quiet, don't let this escalate into a scandal, and protect the youth from unnecessary scrutiny. Reynolds complied, reinforcing his position of minimal intervention. To him, the preservation of Harborview's image and social harmony outweighed the grievances of a few individuals. The law, in his hands, became a tool of convenience rather than justice. But Jake, George, and Emma refused to accept this complacency. They understood that true order could not be imposed through silence and avoidance. It required accountability and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Harborview was at a crossroads, and the choices made in the coming days would shape the town's future. As night fell, Jake stood on the porch with Shadow at his side, gazing out over the harbor's dark waters. The peaceful facade belied the storm brewing beneath, a storm fueled by injustice, fear, and the unyielding desire for dignity. He knew the battle ahead would be difficult, fraught with opposition from those sworn to protect others, yet blinded by their own biases. But Jake also knew that standing firm was the only option. For his father, for Max, for the town that had raised him, and for the promise of a Harborview where respect and justice were not just ideals, but realities. In the quiet of that night, the first true fissures of change began to form, heralding a reckoning that would challenge the very soul of the community. The morning sun filtered through the fog that lingered over Harborview, casting a pale light on the town's weathered streets and quiet harbor. Inside the Harborview Cafe, Emma sat behind the counter, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled through the video on her phone. The footage was raw and unfiltered, a chilling documentation of the bullies' latest acts of cruelty toward George Miller and others who had dared to stand up. The scalding coffee, the theft of Max, the whispered taunts. They were all there, captured in undeniable clarity. Emma's heart pounded as she realized the power the video held. This was more than evidence. It was a call to action. The town's complacency and fear had allowed the bullies to operate unchecked for too long. Now, with this footage, she could break the silence that had gripped Harborview and ignite a firestorm of accountability. But she knew the risks. Harborview was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and crossing the wrong people could have consequences. Dylan's family was influential, their pockets deep, their influence woven into the fabric of the town's politics and economy. Sharing the video could bring retaliation, not just against her, but against George and his son Jake. Yet Emma's conscience would not allow her to stay silent. With a deep breath, Emma uploaded the video to a popular social media platform, adding a simple but powerful caption: "This is happening in Harborview. It's time to stand up for our veterans and our community. Justice for George. Within minutes, the post began to circulate, shared by concerned residents and strangers alike, sparking outrage that rippled far beyond the town's borders. The reaction was immediate and intense. Comments flooded in from people across the state and even the country, condemning the bullying and calling for justice. Local news outlets picked up the story, sending reporters to Harborview to capture the rising tension. The once quiet town was thrust into the spotlight, its hidden wounds exposed for all to see. At the center of this storm stood George Miller, whose quiet dignity in the face of humiliation had become a symbol of resilience and courage. Interviews were arranged, and George, with Jake's support, spoke openly about the harassment, the failures of local law enforcement, and the urgent need for change. His voice, steady and unwavering, resonated with viewers and listeners, inspiring empathy and solidarity. Dylan's parents, powerful figures in Harborview's business community, scrambled to downplay the incident. They held private meetings with town officials and community leaders, attempting to frame the events as misunderstandings blown out of proportion by outsiders. Their public statements emphasized the importance of unity and healing, while privately warning their son to keep a low profile. But the tide was turning. The viral video had shattered the illusion of control that the bullies and their protectors once enjoyed. Harborview's residents, long silenced by fear or indifference, began to find their voices. Community meetings were called, debates ignited, and the cracks in the town's complacency widened. Emma, buoyed by the outpouring of support, took on a new role as an organizer and advocate. She coordinated with local veterans groups, school officials, and concerned citizens to develop a comprehensive plan to address bullying and restore respect within the community. The cafe, once a backdrop for quiet mornings, became a hub of activity and hope. Jake, drawing on his military experience, helped lead workshops on leadership, discipline, and resilience for Harborview's youth. His presence challenged the bullies' dominance and inspired younger residents to stand up for themselves and others. Shadow, his canine partner, became a familiar and reassuring figure in schools and community centers, bridging gaps and fostering trust. Yet, the path forward was not without obstacles. The bullies' families, threatened by the growing momentum, sought to undermine the efforts through intimidation and manipulation. Some community members resisted change, clinging to old loyalties and traditions that excused or ignored the harmful behavior. The battle for Harborview's soul was unfolding on multiple fronts. At a particularly charged town hall meeting, emotions ran high. George spoke passionately about the need for accountability and compassion, urging his neighbors to reject fear and silence. Dylan, present with his parents, avoided direct confrontation but smirked defiantly. The crowd was divided, some applauding George's courage, others whispering doubts and excuses. Emma stood among the audience, her resolve steeled by the support and the challenges alike. She knew this was just the beginning. True transformation would require sustained effort, courage, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But the seed of change had been planted, and the community's response was a testament to the power of visibility and collective action. As the meeting adjourned, Jake approached George and Emma, his expression thoughtful but determined. "We've made a start," he said, "but we need to keep pushing. The town has to see that respect isn't optional, it's essential." George nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We fight for more than ourselves now. We fight for Harborview's future." Outside, the cool evening air carried the echoes of hope and defiance. The story of a small town struggle against bullying and corruption was unfolding in real time, fueled by the courage of a few who refused to accept injustice. Harborview was awakening from its slumber. And though the road ahead was uncertain, the community was beginning to reclaim its heart. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of urgency as Jake, George, and Emma gathered in the modest community center nestled near the harbor's edge. The room, usually reserved for town meetings and social gatherings, was now a hub of whispered anticipation and cautious hope. The recent viral video and its aftermath had shaken Harborview's foundations, and the trio knew that the next steps would require careful planning, alliances, and the courage to confront a deeply entrenched culture of silence. Jake opened the meeting with a calm but commanding presence, his military bearing lending weight to his words. "We're not just fighting bullies," he began. "We're fighting a system that's allowed this behavior to go unchecked. If we want real change, we need support from the community, from the schools, and from those who believe in justice." Emma nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "I've reached out to Mrs. Simmons, the school counselor. She's agreed to help us expose the culture of bullying in the schools and work toward meaningful reform. But we'll need more voices. Parents, teachers, even students willing to stand up." George, steady and resolute, added, "And I'm ready to share my story publicly. If it helps others find their voice, then it's worth it. Pride doesn't mean silence." The room was filled with a small but growing group of concerned citizens, veterans, parents, educators, each drawn by the desire to restore respect and safety to Harborview. Among them was Mrs. Simmons, a soft-spoken woman with a warm smile and a reputation for advocating tirelessly for students caught in the crossfire of bullying. She addressed the group with quiet authority. "Bullying here isn't just isolated incidents. It's a pattern tolerated by many, ignored by some, and even encouraged by others. We'll need to gather testimonies from victims, document these stories carefully, and present them to the school board and town council. Transparency is key." Emma pulled out a folder containing notes and messages from students who had suffered in silence. "These are just a few of many," she said, flipping through the pages. "We have to protect their identities, but their voices matter." Jake outlined a plan to hold community forums and workshops, emphasizing leadership and respect. "We'll teach our youth that strength isn't about domination, but about responsibility. That's how we break the cycle." As the meeting progressed, a few attendees voiced concerns about potential backlash. One parent, her voice shaky, spoke up. "What if the bullies' families retaliate? They're powerful here. We could face threats or worse." George nodded solemnly. "I know that fear. But if we let it stop us, then they've already won." Emma added, "We'll need to be cautious and support each other. No one stands alone in this fight." Amid the discussions, Jake received a discreet text message from an old military contact, a federal agent known for handling cases involving community safety and organized bullying. The agent expressed interest in the situation and suggested a preliminary meeting. Jake shared the news cautiously with the group. "This could be the outside help we need," he said. "But it also means the fight is getting serious. Harborview won't be the same." The group agreed to proceed carefully, balancing the urgency of action with the need for discretion. They began organizing a timeline for gathering evidence and preparing public statements. Emma took on the task of coordinating communication, using her social media skills to rally support while maintaining privacy for those involved. Meanwhile, the bullies' families grew increasingly uneasy. Rumors of federal interest and community mobilization reached their ears, prompting hushed meetings behind closed doors. Dylan's parents convened with other influential figures, strategizing ways to contain the situation and protect their sons from legal and social consequences. Back at the cafe, Emma confided in Mrs. Simmons about her fears and hopes. "It feels like we're walking a tightrope," she said. "One wrong step and everything could unravel." Mrs. Simmons smiled reassuringly. "Change is never easy, but with every story shared, every voice heard, the path becomes clearer. Harborview needs this, more than it knows." George and Jake continued their quiet routines, but the undercurrent of tension was palpable. George prepared to speak at an upcoming town hall meeting, knowing that his words could either unite or further divide the community. Jake trained with Shadow in the early mornings, readying for whatever challenges lay ahead. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the trio met at the pier, the harbor's calm waters reflecting their determined faces. "We've taken the first steps," Jake said. "Now it's about persistence, holding the line no matter what comes." Emma nodded. "And about hope, that this town can heal." George's eyes glistened with a quiet fire. "For Harborview, for the future." The night air was thick with possibility, the kind born of courage and conviction. As they looked out over the dark waters, they knew the road ahead would be fraught with obstacles, but also with the promise of renewal. In the heart of Harborview, a movement was stirring, one built on truth, solidarity, and the unyielding belief that even the smallest voices could rise to challenge the loudest injustices. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the quiet conference room at Harborview High School, where Jake, Emma, George, and Mrs. Simmons had gathered with a small group of students, teachers, and concerned parents. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of unspoken stories pressing against the walls. This was no ordinary meeting. It was a turning point in their fight against the bullying that had plagued the town for far too long. Emma began by distributing a packet of testimonials and notes gathered over the past weeks. Each story was a shard of truth, a glimpse into the pain and fear endured by victims who had long suffered in silence. The students, some fidgeting nervously, others sitting with determined expressions, listened intently as Emma spoke softly but clearly. "These are real experiences from people right here in Harborview," she said. "We're here today to give them a voice, to show that bullying isn't just a phase or harmless teasing. It's a serious problem that affects everyone." One by one, a few brave students stood to share their stories. A girl named Lily recounted the relentless teasing she endured after standing up to Dylan's gang. Her voice trembled but did not break as she described the isolation and anxiety that followed. A boy named Marcus spoke about the fear that kept him from joining school activities, worried he'd become a target. Their words painted a stark picture of a culture that had allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. Mrs. Simmons, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and hope, addressed the room. "These stories are heartbreaking, but they're the first step toward change. We've uncovered a pattern: bullying tolerated by some staff, ignored by others, and dismissed by those who should protect our students." Jake, standing beside Shadow, nodded gravely. "As someone who's seen discipline and teamwork in the most demanding situations, I can tell you that respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of any strong community. Harborview deserves better." The group then turned its attention to the school board members present, who listened with a mix of discomfort and concern. Questions were raised about existing policies, reporting procedures, and the accountability of staff and students alike. The board members promised to review their protocols, but the undercurrent of institutional inertia was palpable. Emma, sensing the need for concrete action, proposed the formation of an independent task force to investigate bullying complaints and oversee the implementation of new anti-bullying programs. "We need transparency and accountability," she insisted. "The community deserves to know that these issues are being taken seriously." George, his voice steady despite the emotional weight, added, "And we need to support the victims, not just with words, but with real resources. Counseling, peer support groups, and safe spaces." The meeting ended with a tentative agreement to establish the task force, comprising students, parents, educators, and community leaders. It was a small victory, but a significant one. As the room emptied, whispers of hope mingled with lingering doubts about the road ahead. Outside, Emma and Jake walked together along the school's perimeter, the evening chill sharpening the edges of their resolve. "We've got proof, a united front, and growing community support," Emma said. "But the real challenge is changing hearts and minds." Jake looked out toward the darkening harbor. Culture doesn't shift overnight. It's a slow burn, but with continued pressure and education, we can break the cycle. In the days that followed, the task force began its work, conducting interviews with students and staff, compiling reports, and identifying areas where the school's response had fallen short. A video confession from one of the bullies, a young man named Tyler, who had recently distanced himself from Dylan's gang, emerged as a pivotal piece of evidence. In the recording, Tyler acknowledged the harm caused by their actions, expressing remorse and a desire to help change the toxic environment. The confession was shared cautiously within the community, sparking mixed reactions. Some saw it as a breakthrough, a sign that even those who had perpetuated the bullying could change. Others viewed it with skepticism, questioning its sincerity and fearing it might be used to deflect responsibility from the more powerful members of the gang. Emma and Mrs. Simmons worked closely with Tyler, encouraging him to speak at upcoming forums and advocate for anti-bullying initiatives. His willingness to come forward inspired others to share their experiences, slowly peeling back the layers of silence and denial. Meanwhile, Dylan's influence began to wane as the community's collective voice grew louder. Parents who had once defended their son's behavior faced mounting pressure to acknowledge the damage caused. The local media continued to cover the story, highlighting Harborview's efforts to confront its problems and rebuild trust. Despite progress, challenges persisted. Resistance from certain factions within the town remained fierce, with whispers of retaliation and intimidation surfacing. Jake and George remained vigilant, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over. One afternoon, as Jake and Emma reviewed the task force's latest findings in a quiet corner of the cafe, they shared a moment of quiet determination. "We're making headway," Jake said, "but we have to be ready for whatever comes next." Emma nodded. "This is a marathon, not a sprint. But every story shared, every voice heard, is a step closer to a safer Harborview." Outside, the harbor's waters shimmered under an overcast sky, reflecting the town's tumultuous journey from fear and silence toward hope and accountability. In the hearts of those who refused to back down, a quiet revolution was underway. One built on courage, truth, and the belief that even the smallest voices could spark lasting change. The crisp morning air in Harborview was tinged with a new kind of tension as federal agents arrived quietly, their presence a stark contrast to the town's usual calm. The Department of Education and the Veterans Affairs Agency had responded swiftly to the mounting evidence brought forth by Jake, Emma, George, and their allies. The small community, once reluctant to confront its problems, now faced scrutiny from outside forces determined to uncover the truth behind the bullying and institutional neglect that had plagued the town. In the polished conference room of the town hall, federal investigators sat across from school officials, law enforcement representatives, and community leaders. The mood was tense, the weight of impending accountability palpable. The agents laid out their findings with clinical precision, documented cases of bullying, ignored complaints, and a pattern of negligence that extended beyond the school walls into the broader community. Chief Tom Reynolds, visibly uncomfortable, attempted to downplay the severity of the situation. "We've always handled these matters internally," he insisted, his voice tight. "These are kids being kids, and sometimes discipline is a delicate balance. We don't want to ruin futures over youthful mistakes." One of the agents, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Ramirez, met his gaze steadily. "With all due respect, Chief, the evidence shows a systemic failure to protect vulnerable students and veterans like Mr. Miller. Ignoring these issues has allowed harassment and intimidation to flourish unchecked." The room fell silent as the reality of the situation settled over the officials. The federal agent's presence was a clear message. Harborview's way of turning a blind eye was no longer acceptable. Outside the meeting, George watched with a mixture of relief and wariness. Years of service had taught him to trust action over words, and while the federal intervention was a victory, he knew the road ahead would be challenging. "This is just the beginning," he told Jake quietly. "We have to stay vigilant." Jake nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We'll make sure they follow through. No more excuses." The investigation led to swift action. The Department of Education mandated immediate reforms in the school's policies, including mandatory anti-bullying training for staff and students, the establishment of confidential reporting systems, and the appointment of an independent oversight committee. Veterans Affairs extended support services to George and others affected, acknowledging the unique challenges faced by those who had served. The fallout was significant. Chief Reynolds was suspended pending further review, his complicity in the town's culture of neglect exposed. The Bullies faced disciplinary actions ranging from counseling mandates to temporary suspensions, signaling a shift from tolerance to accountability. Dylan, in particular, found himself stripped of the protections once afforded by his family's influence. Community meetings became forums for honest dialogue, with residents grappling openly with the town's failures and the path forward. The conversations were uncomfortable but necessary, peeling back layers of denial and fear that had long shielded the bullies and their enablers. Emma, Jake, and George stood at the forefront of these efforts, their voices steady as they advocated for transparency and healing. Emma coordinated with local organizations to implement programs focused on empathy, conflict resolution, and leadership among youth. Jake continued his workshops, emphasizing the importance of respect and responsibility, not only in the military, but in everyday life. Mrs. Simmons worked tirelessly within the schools, providing counseling and support to victims and offenders alike, fostering an environment where accountability was paired with understanding and growth. Her efforts helped bridge divides, encouraging students to break free from the cycles of aggression and silence. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Some families resisted the changes, unwilling to relinquish their influence or acknowledge their children's roles in the harm caused. Rumors of backlash and intimidation persisted, and the town's scars were far from healed. But Harborview's spirit was shifting. The federal investigation had peeled back the veneer of complacency, exposing the rot beneath, but also illuminating the possibility of renewal. The town was learning that true strength lay not in silence or protectionism, but in confronting painful truths and embracing the hard work of change. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the harbor, Jake, George, and Emma met at the old pier. The waters shimmered with the fading light, a mirror to the town's tentative hopes. "We've come a long way," George said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But the real test is keeping this momentum." Jake looked out across the water, Shadow resting calmly by his side. "We fight for more than justice now. We fight for a future where Harborview's children can grow up safe and respected. Emma smiled, a spark of optimism in her eyes. And where silence no longer protects the wrongdoers. As night fell, the trio stood together, united by a shared commitment to their town. Harborview was far from perfect. But the tide of change was undeniable. With vigilance, courage, and community, they believed the town could heal and begin to flourish once more. The story of Harborview was still unfolding, marked by struggle but also by the indomitable power of those who dared to stand, amend for what was right. The first crisp days of winter settled over Harborview, painting the town in hues of gray and white, yet beneath the cold exterior, a quiet warmth was beginning to kindle within the community. The recent upheaval, the federal investigations, the exposure of long-ignored abuses, and the ensuing reforms had left scars, but also sowed seeds of renewal. The town, once divided and silenced by fear, was now tentatively stitching itself back together. One conversation, one apology, and one small act of reconciliation at a time. At the heart of this fragile healing was a series of newly implemented anti-bullying programs in the schools, led by Mrs. Simmons. Her classrooms buzzed with cautious optimism as students engaged in open discussions about respect, empathy, and accountability. The earlier walls of fear and silence were cracking, and voices once stifled found room to be heard. Tyler, the former bully who had confessed, had become an unlikely advocate, sharing his story and encouraging peers to choose a different path. A particularly moving moment came during a school assembly when Dylan, the once defiant ringleader of the Bullies, stepped onto the stage. His face was solemn, eyes meeting those of his classmates with a vulnerability that surprised many. "I was wrong," he began, his voice steady but laced with regret. "I hurt people I should have protected. I'm sorry to George, to the students I bullied, and to this town. I want to help make things right." The room was silent, the weight of his apology hanging in the air. Some students nodded slowly, others wiped away tears. It was a tentative step toward reconciliation, a recognition that healing required humility and courage from all sides. Outside the school walls, the community rallied around George Miller and his son Jake, whose leadership had become a beacon of strength and resilience. Local veterans groups collaborated with schools and civic organizations to create mentorship programs, fostering bonds between generations and instilling values of honor and respect. These initiatives helped restore a sense of pride and belonging that had been eroded by months of conflict. Emma, who had become a community organizer and advocate, co-chaired a newly formed committee dedicated to transparency in local governance and community welfare. The committee worked tirelessly to ensure that the injustices uncovered would not be buried again beneath layers of silence and denial. Public meetings were held regularly, inviting residents to voice concerns, propose solutions, and hold officials accountable. The transformation extended beyond programs and policies. It seeped into everyday interactions. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now exchanged greetings, shared meals, and collaborated on town projects. The Harborview Cafe, once a silent witness to conflict, became a gathering place for dialogue and connection, its tables filled with stories of hope and plans for the future. Sheriff Brody Kent, who had previously downplayed the bullying and sided with the town's influential families, found himself sidelined amid growing calls for reform. New leadership emerged, committed to justice and community service rather than protectionism. The shift was subtle but profound, signaling a break from the past. George and Jake, though tempered by the struggles they had endured, found renewal in their roles as mentors and leaders. George spoke at local events, sharing his journey with quiet dignity, inspiring others to stand firm in the face of adversity. Jake continued to train and teach, his military discipline now channeled into nurturing the next generation. One afternoon, as snowflakes drifted softly over the harbor, George and Jake stood side by side on the dock, watching the water ripple beneath the winter sky. "We've come a long way," George said, the lines on his face softened by a rare smile. "But it's the people, their courage to change, that makes all the difference." Jake nodded, his gaze steady. Harborview's stronger now because it faced its darkness, and because it chose to stand up together. In the weeks that followed, the town's collective efforts bore fruit. Reports of bullying declined significantly, replaced by stories of kindness, inclusion, and mutual respect. The community's resilience was tested but ultimately strengthened, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and commitment. The legacy of the struggle endured, not as a tale of division, but as a testament to the power of courage, faith, and redemption. Harborview's revival was a mosaic of many voices and actions, each piece vital to the whole. From the once silent victims to the repentant bullies, from the steadfast veterans to the brave advocates. The town had found a new rhythm, grounded in justice and unity. As the sun set on a clear winter evening, casting a golden glow over the snow-dusted harbor, Harborview rested not just in peace, but in promise. The journey was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for a future where respect and kindness would guide the community forward. In the heart of this small town, hope had taken root, and with it, the enduring belief that even in the darkest times, light could prevail. The harbor's stillness was punctuated only by the soft lapping of waves against the weathered wooden pilings as Jake and George stood side by side, their figures silhouetted against the fading amber sky. The town of Harborview stretched out before them, its streets glistening under the first light of dawn, rooftops dusted with snow, and the faint glow of windows hinting at lives stirred by hope and quiet renewal. This was a place once fractured by fear and silence, now slowly knitting itself back together through courage and conviction. George, his shoulders squared despite the weight of his years, looked out across the water with a reflective gaze. The journey from the coffee's scalding sting to this fragile peace had been arduous, marked by pain, resistance, and unyielding resolve. Yet, standing here, he felt a profound sense of purpose. Not just as a veteran who had served his country, but as a father and community member who had fought to reclaim the dignity of his home. Jake, his K-9 partner's shadow resting faithfully at his side, broke the silence. It wasn't easy. The town had to face itself, its past, its mistakes. But we stood firm. George nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. It took every bit of strength we had, and then some. But it was worth it. For the kids, for the veterans, for everyone who deserved respect. The transformation in Harborview was more than policy changes or investigations. It was a testament to the power of standing up against injustice, no matter how deeply entrenched. The scars of bullying and neglect remained, but they no longer defined the town's spirit. Instead, they served as reminders of what had been overcome and what must never be allowed to happen again. Ara Wilson, once a quiet widow, had emerged as a vocal advocate for transparency, co-chairing a community committee with Emma. Their partnership symbolized the new era, a blend of strength and compassion driving Harborview forward. Owen, Ara's son and Jake's close friend, had become a pillar of leadership, mentoring youth and bridging gaps that once seemed insurmountable. The town's revival was evident in everyday moments. The laughter of children playing in freshly cleared schoolyards, neighbors gathering at the cafe sharing stories over warm coffee, and veterans supporting one another with renewed pride. The community's collective heartbeat had found a steady rhythm, one grounded in respect and unity. Yet, the journey was not solely about Harborview. It was a story echoed in countless towns grappling with their own shadows. The courage of a few had sparked a movement that transcended boundaries, reminding all that change begins with standing firm against corruption, fear, and indifference. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light over the harbor, Jake turned to George. "What's next? For us? For the town?" George's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. "We keep building. We keep teaching. We don't let complacency creep back in. This is just the beginning of a new chapter." Shadow lifted his head, alert and attentive, embodying the vigilance needed to safeguard the hard-won peace. Together, the trio, man, son, and dog, stood as guardians of hope, resilience, and the enduring fight for justice. In the distance, the church bells chimed, softly, their melody weaving through the crisp morning air, a hymn of redemption and renewal. Harborview had weathered its darkest storms and emerged stronger, a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. As light flooded the town, the story of courage, faith, and redemption in Harborview became a beacon, illuminating the path for others facing their own battles. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, when silence seems deafening and fear overwhelming, the power to change lies within those who dare to stand up, speak out, and believe. The harbor shimmered with promise, the waves carrying whispers of hope and the unwavering truth that light can and will prevail.